introduction to existentialism was through the French philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre. Even though he coined the term existentialism, existentialism really is a much broader and older Western European philosophical movement. In other words, it originated in Western Europe. Starting in the 19th century. Some people would actually argue a little bit earlier in the 18th century with the philosophy of the Danish thinker Søren Kierkegaard, who is pictured right here on your left-hand side. Now, regardless of the particular origin, sorry, we're moving a little bit fast here. Regardless of those origins in the philosophy of Søren Kierkegaard, by the 19th century, so the 1800s in Western Europe, Nietzsche's time, the question of existentialism really centered on this critique that people felt was happening to the role of the individual in relation to culture. So a lot of people started to feel like the individual's lived experiences as a prime source of knowledge, right? How we know what we know, any type of information about how to live our lives, values, ideals, was being subordinated to larger worldviews, such as the rationalist worldview. In the Middle Ages, existentialism, which did not exist in the Middle Ages, but existentialism might have, if it did exist back then, might have then critiqued the subordination of the individual's lived experiences to what? To the religious worldview, right? Or the institutional church as the primary source of the individual's lived experiences as a source of knowledge. Remember, existentialism is based on knowledge through human existence, right? Your own existence. So anything that gets in the way of the individual's worldview as a source of knowledge is going to be generally looked down upon by existentialists. So, as we've seen last week in Sartre, existentialism really emphasizes the individual's own autonomy or self-directedness. That's another word for autonomy. Their personal freedom and their freedom of choice, including their responsibility as well. But those are the core tenets. Now, in particularly going towards the 19th century and the 20th century, existentialism arose in response to what we call the crisis in meaning that followed first the rise of science, modernity, and as we'll talk about later in this lecture, mass culture. Okay, so remember that Sartre in the supplement lecture, we talked about how it is that Sartre is really responding to how it is that we need to have existentialist responses to what kind of crisis? The death of meaning, right? Nihilism, the death of absolutes in the 20th century, the lack of moral guidance with the loss of sort of the great, particularly in the Holocaust, with the great moral narratives. How might science do this? Well, because science also provides a sort of overarching truth, right? Something that's true in itself that sort of puts the individual in a bind. The individual that comes up and says, yeah, gravity is not a fact or gravity doesn't exist, is then put in a sort of bind in terms of authority regarding knowledge. So those are all ways in which the individual, starting in the 19th century, started to be, their authority started to be subordinated to these larger forces that were emerging in culture. Now, by the 20th century, existentialism really started to critique, and we'll repeat this again and again, the leveling qualities of modern living. By leveling here, we just mean making everything the same, leveling to the ground, right? Leveling to one dimension rather than multi-dimension. So anytime you have everybody sort of on the same plane, existentialism is going to get upset because individuals are supposed to be sort of very special individual units. Kind of like snowflakes, right? Each little snowflake is sort of individual onto its own, but yet can partake in the same general form when looked from afar. We're all people, but close up, we are just having immense and rich diversity. So by the 20th century and late 19th century, The leveling of human beings was especially evident in mass culture, and the way in which the sort of population boom and the rise in mass population in Western Europe and also abroad in the Anglo-European world started to create just a surplus population, right? More and more people, mass culture, and this had the sort of effect of alienating individuals, creating institutions that were suited to treat everybody the same, like standardized testing. And this was really, really deeply problematic for figures like Friedrich Nietzsche, who believed that the rise of mass culture was going to yield some particular problems for human individuals, because we would all be faced with a struggle of kind of one-size-fits-all approaches. We would be forced to live, work, be educated, enjoy the arts, all these kinds of things in terms of what is popular, what is in favor with the masses, what is leveled down to accommodate for sameness, right? Chain restaurants and standardized testing and any other type of mass cultural institutions. So the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, that was deeply influenced by the sort of German romantic tradition that values a human individual against the forces of nature, Nietzsche is going to develop very important philosophical and literary concepts that are going to try, if anything else, to just give voice to the ways in which modernity is going to, and modern culture, is going to split and fragment individuals. But in other words, he's going to try to give an account of the fallout, all the possible bad things that could happen as a result of the rise of mass culture. But he's going to do it in such a way that he points out how difficult it is for human beings to diagnose such a problem because of what he'll see as the dominant philosophical and cultural perspectives of the time, benign rational perspectives. To give you an example of this, if you were to get very upset at your education, your educational experience, and let's say in high school, most of you, or a large number of you that were educated in Florida education, had to take the FCATs, right? And many of you will rightly sort of intimate that you were being tested in a way that may not have reflected what you felt was your true understanding or knowledge of a subject. You were just preparing for a standardized test rather than something that could really truly assess your knowledge of a subject matter or the way you've integrated it into your life as a critical education. Now, if someone were to come and say, and we're going to now do away with all standardized testing, very, very quickly, a whole host of rational line by line sort of argumentative justifications would be given, especially like at the state level or at administrative level, even at an institution, as to why that's going to be difficult or cumbersome. In other words, very strong rational arguments would be mounted. And so Nietzsche is going to say it's going to be so difficult to give voice to these problems when it is so easy to have recourse to tools of thinking and arguing that make it seem as if the modern ways of living and working are indeed very rational. Another example is very simply work, right? Why do we work? Why do we go to school? To get a degree so we can have a good job, so that we can get insurance, so we can have higher standards of living. And to question those kinds of things, to question the getting a university degree as a symbolic representation of your learning, of your education, is going to be really, really difficult in today's day and age, or in the rise of the modern era. And I sort of go on this, I sort of start talking about this because in many ways, we'll see that when we get into Fight Club, a lot of the difficulties that the narrator experiences in his day-to-day job really stem from the incredible pull of conforming to the everyday world of consumer choices, of buying the right IKEA furniture, of having had the right degree, of now having a good sort of administrative position that gives him some regularity, and to just do away and blow it all up would seem rather irrational. So this is the tension that's going to happen, is the fight against these forces that may not be contributing to a quote-unquote life well lived, and the sort of irrationalism of our objections to such a system. Okay? So the article that we had to read for today, for this week, is going to introduce Nietzsche's ideas as the key to understanding the movie Fight Club. And to do so, he outlines very, very clearly what he's attempting to do. Let's take a look at it, right? And he couldn't be any clearer. So he says, I argue in this essay that one has to go back to Nietzsche's early work on Greek tragedy to understand the film's nuanced imagery. In other words, if you really want to understand what's really going on, not just at the surface level, but what the film's really about, we have to go to just Nietzsche's concepts in his very first books. And those books just happen to be on the concepts of Greek tragedy. And Greek tragedy here just means like the place of Aeschylus or Sophocles. That's what he means by Greek tragedy, those great tragic plays like Oedipus and Antigone. Then he says, reviewing the key conceptions of the Apollonian and Dionysian, those are Nietzsche's concepts, as they are presented in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche's book, affords one the possibility of understanding how these notions relate not just to the character of Tyler Durden, but to that of the narrator as well. Okay, so take note. It is on Skeese's view, it is almost impossible, if not difficult, very difficult, to understand one without understanding the other. So just talking about the role of one figure in this particular film is not going to be very fruitful if we don't also talk about the narrator, the figure of the narrator, which, importantly speaking, is just generally referred to as the narrator, even though we find out that just the general name Jack, right? We don't really get very clearly on a sense of identity or a sense of a name. This is carried, by the way, this theme in existentialist movies is carried through, just like in the movie V for Vendetta. The name of the main character, V, is just that, like a generalized stand-in for where he was forged, or in Lark Hill in imprisonment. He also tells us that reading the characters of the film alongside these works puts one in a better position to understand the film's philosophically interesting concept. So two things. The first thing is that he seems to be, when talking about the content as philosophically interesting, he's holding the view, even implicitly, that this film is not doing philosophy, but is philosophical. Other authors hold a much stronger view that works, such as Ingrid Bergman's The Seventh Seal. That's where Death, in the beginning of the semester, where we saw the clip from Death playing a chess match, right? Or someone playing a match with Death. That would be seen as doing philosophy, providing a thesis, even in illustrative form or metaphoric film or visual form, is putting forth an argument and sustaining it through discourse. Here, Skeese is taking a more understated approach, where he is saying it is deeply philosophical, and in a way that yields greater insight into the movie. But the movie here, the text of the movie, seems to be sort of privileged by Skeese. But there's another clue to this sentence that's important here. He says this puts us in a better position to understand it. better position as opposed to what? So he's clearly telling us that there have been other positions which Skees believes are misguided or incorrect. And so we've got to turn, he spends the next few pages trying to unpack those particular positions. So let's take a look at those positions. So according to Skees, there are two, or there have been, up until now, two dominant interpretations of the movie Fight Club. The first interpretation that people tend, scholars, film scholars, philosophers of film as well, have tended to apply to the film, particularly when it first came out, is the notion that Fight Club is actually kind of a metaphor, this great metaphor for a modern day cultural backlash to what some scholars see as the, quote, feminization of male identity. So in gender studies departments that focused on male studies or studies of masculinity, that's not to say that they're aggressive proponents of it, just the study of. The film was received as a kind of counter thrust to the way in which generalized Western masculinity as dominant, aggressive, as a rational, willful agent, a declarative authority, a strong man, someone in control, a provider, someone who has a sense of direction in their lives. All of those sort of active type of verbs that have historically been associated with male identity have been undermined in modern culture due to the rise of sort of mechanized identities or lots of different things. So the examples, excuse me for going, we just got a very fancy mouse here and it's sometimes a little too sensitive here. So the examples on the right here would be examples of what these scholars would refer to as the feminization of male identity. And of course, Skees and of course other feminist scholars would object to the sort of the way in which that is cashed out, arguing that there's no such thing as a feminized identity that's true in itself. But nonetheless, all you need to know is that these representations of being sort of passive, having to do what you're told at work, figuring out who you are by virtue of very limited options from a catalog, just being a sort of a passive receiver of news, all of those things, having to be kind of like a yes man and answer to your boss or the world or cultural norms, all of those are violently sort of answered by just the opposite, by fighting, by a fight club, where men get to act out in a great gladiatorial type of stage, all of their sort of repressed libidinal and masculine testosteronal energies in order to take a stand on their identity. Okay, so to be clear, Skees is saying this is a bad interpretation of the movie. He's not saying that it can't be pulled out of, with a good argument, that it can't be pulled out of the movie, but that to look at it this way is going to really miss the point, and more importantly, to look at it this way will miss differences that make a difference in terms of interpretation and insights about the film, really rich nuances, right, subtleties that will really be differences that make a difference, that you'll see the film in a completely different way if you take this simple approach that it's a general backlash against male identity. Okay, so that's the first. So this would be a kind of general question on the exam is, what does Ski say are the two prominent interpretations up until now of Fight Club, and what is the first one, and why does he think this is wrong? What's wrong about it, or what can you miss? So remember, he doesn't think that they're wrong in themselves. Nothing is wrong in itself if you can provide a reasonable argument that's backed up by argumentative justifications that are evidence-based, that you can go back to the film as a text and point to A, B, C, and D, and you can make the case. You can see that, sure, look at all these men fighting, getting their aggression on, and trying to stand up for what is perceived as a passive existence. But if you do, again, says Skees, you will miss important differences and nuances that will completely change your view of the film and the real richness of it. Okay, now the second prominent and dominant interpretation of Fight Club up until now, and this is the one that's just sort of so mainstream. I remember even when I first saw the movie, this was, until very recently, this was for quite some time, for a couple of years actually, this was the dominant interpretation of the film. The film was seen as a Marxist or economic critique of modern consumer society. It was a critique of consumerism, modern consumerism. And in this sense, all of the sort of the great lines that Tyler Durden gives us are some really great lines about consumerism and the way in which patterns of consumption don't just shape who we are, that we're not in control of them, they're in control of us, right? That the quote-unquote stuff we own ends up owning us. And so it was seen as a critique, as a staunch critique of the way in which modern consumer culture, by giving us a one-size-fits-all approach that masquerades under under the specter of individualization. Okay, what does that mean? That sounds a little complex. So let me slow it down here. So one of the ways to look at modern consumer culture is that individuals feel as if they're exactly that, individuals. How does that work? Well, because when we go into the Gap, or when we go into IKEA, or when we go into any of these stores, we feel like the stuff that we come out with in our shopping bags accurately reflect our individual tastes, our individual personalities, fun, frilly, serious, business, casual, whatever it is. There's like a name for everything these days. I can hardly keep up with all the different looks, right? In the same way that our iPhones are all sort of personalized, the phenomenon of personalization. Our iPhones are all personalized with a whole host of different apps that we can download. So if I were to pick up one of my students' iPhones and just take a look at the apps, they would be starkly different from the apps on my phone, right? If you open up my iPhone, you might see you would see actually an app from right away from something like NPR, or a kind of etymological dictionary, or daily philosophy quotes, or something of the like. And the weather report somewhere. And that's supposed to say something, I feel as if that reflects my individuality. But at the end of the day, we all have iPhones, right? Loosely speaking, of course, or access to the same technologies. We shop at the same sort of places. We go to the mall. We engage. What are we doing on a Friday night? We're at Bell Tower or Gulf Coast Town Center. We're still engaging in the same structurally identical activities, but feel as if they individually speak or represent us. Now, the critique of the consumer culture that Tyler Durden sort of launches is one that says, no, this consumerism is actually producing not individual identities, but one mass general identity that can masquerade or is self-sufficient insofar as it just produces this type of illusion. I'll repeat this again towards the end, because it's actually going to tie in when we talk about Nietzsche and modern culture, excuse me. And but I highly suggest the link here. It's a brief clip from the film too, but it just takes all of those key scenes and compresses them so that you get a really good narrative of the economic critique of consumer society. Skees thinks that this too is wrong, though really well argued and supported, because there's strong evidence. But of course, in order to prove this wrong, he's going to say there is even stronger evidence for understanding Fight Club as not a Marxist or economic critique, but as an existential film. So again, for Skees, Fight Club is first, foremost an existential text. It is an existential text, an existential film that accurately portrays existential themes at their core, at its core. Sure, it also incorporates modern critiques of consumer society through a Marxist lens, but at its core, it's an existentialist text. She says on page 14, for instance, a thorough existentialist reading, by that he means a Nietzschean reading of the film, is going to show both interpretations, the cultural backlash to feminization of male identity and the critique of modern consumer society as misreadings of Fight Club. Okay, so let's get started with Nietzsche. Okay, so Nietzsche was a German philosopher, famous German philosopher, popularized in lots of different films. Many of you have seen sort of the posters or of Nietzsche's profile with his large mustache. He's probably one of the most well-known figures or representations of philosophy. And he's considered to be the father of modern existentialism. Oftentimes, we learn of Nietzsche through just terribly mispopularized quotes today, like "What doesn't kill us makes us stronger." That's actually that's Nietzsche's line. "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." It was first appropriated in that Arnold Schwarzenegger film Conan the Barbarian. That was the opening line, and I think now today, who is it that has completely appropriated it for the decadence of modernity and mass culture? Is it Britney Spears? No, it's the other. It's not Britney Spears. Kelly Clarkson. Yes, there we go. So that's Nietzsche. There are lots of different kind of Nietzscheanisms that are all around us, but sort of we don't recognize as such. Sometimes he's famous for the line, "God is dead," which is also generally misquoted because half the sentence is always read, not the other half or the latter half. That just takes half the sentence. So suffice it to say that Nietzsche is a very difficult philosopher to understand, partly because he never wrote in a really systematized format. So his writing style, which was also called the aphorism, you won't be tested on this, but it was kind of like fragments or poetic-like type of prose, didn't lend itself to clarity in a way that a scientific text would lend itself to clarity, right? We know what that tract about biology or the mechanisms of retroviruses are. It was more poetic, so there was a lot of type of stylistic type of influence in his writing that lended itself to some misinterpretation. So he's a very difficult philosopher with very complex but deeply influential ideas. Arguably, he's one of the most influential philosophers of the 19th century, particularly in philosophy. Now, he's after Soren Kierkegaard, he's really seen as the father of existentialism. A lot of what we're going to say today is going to sound so similar to what Sartre was saying. And what Sartre did is, in many ways, he took a lot of kind of Nietzsche's ideas and just sort of couched them in the language of action and responsibility and choices. But they're really very kind of strong Nietzscheanisms. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through kind of four important conceptions that Nietzsche had, key concepts. The critique of modernity, his critique of modern culture. And remember, I'll repeat this again, but when we talk about modernity in philosophy, it's a technical term. Modernity just means the modern era, or also associated with post-Cartesian thought or post-Cartesian, Cartesian meaning after, relating to Descartes, René Descartes, whom we studied. But modernity really is the kind of culture that came after Descartes, that because Descartes began the spirit of rationalism, so the scientific revolution, anything after the 1600s is considered modernity because it gave rise to science. So he gives us a critique of modernity. He's also going to give us a famous distinction, the Apollonian-Dionysian distinction. All of you know the Apollonian-Dionysian distinction. You just don't know it by name, but you'll see it that you know the concept. The concepts will be so easy for you. You'll be like, so that's where that comes from. He'll also talk about the reevaluation of values, which will also be extremely easy for you to understand. You'll just say, well, that's just how kids revolt, or that's just nonconformism, but it actually is like most concepts today, are rooted in some philosophical conception that whose origin we have forgotten. And then we'll talk about the three metamorphoses of the spirit. Okay. All of these concepts can be understood under the question of personal identity. We'll talk about that in the next slide.